The following is Class 15 on the Yoga Sutras, given by Hridayananda Das Goswami in fall of 2004 in San Luis Obispo. Mantra 7 of Sri Ishopanishad will be discussed for the first 17 minutes. Then Sutras 336 to 345 will be covered.
We're going to chant this verse from the mantra number 7 in the Ishopanishad, and perhaps the most respected scholar in America who specializes in the Upanishads is a professor named Patrick Olivelle at the University of Texas in Austin. And so I was looking at his translation of the Ishopanishad just to compare notes. And he mentions that this is sort of a particularly difficult verse to translate, isn't it? There's one Sanskrit German, Paul Thiem, who was actually the professor of the person who became my professor at Harvard, but he wrote an article, he wrote not an article, he wrote a whole thing on this verse. I think I got it though. I feel that we got it. Looked at a few translations. So we'll chant this first, and then you'll hear it first. The music just breaking here, the real translation of this verse. So please repeat. Yasmin Sarvani Bhutani Atma Eva. I'm sort of separating the words there. Abhut Vijanata Tatra Ko Moha Ka Shoka Ekatvam Anupashyatah Jasmin Sarvani Bhutani Atmaiva Bhutvijanata Tatra Ko Moha Kakshoka Ekatvam Anupashyatah Jasmin Sarvani Bhutani Atmaiva Bhutvijanata Tatra Ko Moha Kakshoka Ekatvam Anupashyata Yasmin Sarvani Bhutani Atmaiva Bhutvijanata Tatra Ko Moha Kakshoka Ekatvam Anupashyata. So I'll read the translation. I noticed that I left out one word in my translation, which of course is not my fault. Couldn't be. I'm a little tired, but so I will stick the word in when I read it that I've left out. In that. Oh, you put. Well. In that here refers to the soul. All of them agrees with that because it refers back to the previous verse, which was talking about the soul. In that soul, all creatures actually become soul. For one who understands, who steadily sees, and it should say the oneness, who steadily sees this oneness. What illusion, what sorrow is there? So after the word who steadily sees, it should say who steadily sees the oneness, which in Sanskrit is the word ekatvam. So this is how I would explain this verse to you. Yasmin. We have an enthusiastic group here. So the idea here is that all creatures, Sarvani Bhutani, Atmaiva Bhut, have become actually a soul, become a soul, or come to be soul in that supreme soul. So this is the first thing. What this means is quite simple. The whole purpose of yoga is that by connecting ourselves, which is what yoga means, connection or union. So by connecting ourselves to God, Ishvara, which is the word Patanjali always uses, the Lord. By connecting ourselves to Ishvara, the Lord, we realize our own nature. We realize our own nature. a simple point. For example, take the part of anything. If you consider that we are part of God, I mean, for example, a part of a watch. The part of a watch realizes its nature or becomes what it really is meant to be when it's within the watch. So when the part has a proper relationship, yoga, when a part in general has a proper relationship with the whole, so that it serves the whole in the way that it's meant to, then the part realizes its actual identity. It becomes what it's really supposed to be. And so in that sense, through yoga, in connection with Ishvara, God or the Lord or Krishna, whatever word you use, in connection with God, we become what we really are. Only in that relationship, in that yoga, in that connection. And when we artificially separate ourselves, then God is not diminished, but we lose our identity. For example, another example that's given is when you pull a leaf off a tree, the leaf separated from the tree dries up. It dries up. The leaf is alive, so to speak. It's green. It's a real leaf in a sense when it's connected to the tree. And it's interesting that I've always noticed that when a leaf is separated from a tree, it doesn't instantly dry up. I mean, you can pull a green leaf off a tree and it's still green. You say, well, look, leaves are the same whether they're connected or separated from trees. But in time, it dries up. And you can see this also in individual lives and in history. You can see cultures that separate themselves from their spiritual roots. And at first it looks like fun and games. I mean, there's economic prosperity and we're doing fine. We didn't need all that old-fashioned religion. And then in time, society starts to literally degrade. And we see all kinds of decadence set in. The moral standard collapses. It's like a dog-eat-dog world, and everyone's running around. And what went wrong? Well, it's like the leaf that was pulled off the tree. It's basically drying up and losing its life. And in individual lives also, people may sometimes choose the path of selfishness and egotism, and like the picture of Dorian Gray, the great story. So, what this mantra is saying really is that within the Supreme Soul, all creatures actually become soul. They realize their nature. That within the soul, capital S, the soul's small s, realize their nature in that connection, in that relationship. For example, let's say if someone's part of a family and somehow they're estranged from their family. And so it's when they somehow are restored to their family, the relationship is healed, and then again that identity comes to life, that I'm part of this family. So then, the next statement here is Vijanataha tatrako moha kakshoka ikatam anupashita. So, Vijanata means for one who understands this. For a person who understands this, and ekatvam anupashita, who is steadily seeing this oneness, this connection between ourselves and God, tatra, there, ko moha, what illusion, kakshoka, what sorrow. Rhetorical question. In other words, there is none. How could there be illusion? How could there be sorrow for one who understands one's relationship to God and is seeing this oneness with God, this very intimate connection with God? There's no illusion, there's no sorrow. The converse is also true, that if there is illusion or sorrow, the person didn't get it. That the real cause of illusion and sorrow is not understanding this intimate connection. So it's a very nice statement from the Isupasa, a very ancient statement, many thousands of years old, and yet nothing has really changed. I mean, I suppose automobiles didn't look the same back then, or computer games were different, but nothing important has changed. So, any questions on that? That mantra from the Isha Upanishad?
Is there anything lost in the translation?
I don't think so. Some of the elegance, the literary elegance perhaps, but not the message. There's actually two schools on this. This is interesting. And I'll just talk for a minute on this. That obviously there are many different cultures in the world. And not only synchronically, not only like right now, like you stop the clocks and look right now in the earth, there are many different cultures. Or look back in time. There have always been many different cultures, and so there's a lot of diversity. And so, according to the Gita, I'll frame this in the philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita, because Krishna explicitly addresses the issue of some people claiming that people from different cultures can't really understand each other. We don't really know what it felt like to be an Egyptian, or even today to be a Bulgarian. We can't really get in their skin. And some people say, no, they're universals. According to the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna addresses this point, by the way. In chapter 18, the last chapter of the Gita, text 20 to 22. What Krishna says there is that when people, there are these three qualities of nature. There's starting from the bottom going up. So we'll have a happy ending. There's ignorance, darkness, people that are just grossly irrational and violent and lethargic and just lazy, can't really get anything done, can't get it, can't understand things, just real ignorance. And then above that, there's passion, people who are ambitious and passionate and sort of into the world, trying to enjoy the world. And then there's goodness, there's this platform of virtue and serenity and peace. So, goodness, generosity. And so, what Krishna says is that when people are predominantly passionate, they see the diversity of the world as fundamental. So that Americans and let's say, Ethiopians or whatever, they're really just different, period. That these are fundamental differences and they can't really understand each other. When we translate, we can't really ever know exactly what it is, all that stuff. Whereas Krishna says, and people in goodness see the oneness. They see that there is diversity. They don't ignore the diversity, but they see behind it a oneness. And that's Krishna's statement. So that the ability, personally, having done a lot of translation in various languages. I mean, having translated from Spanish to English, from English to Spanish, from Portuguese to English, from English to Portuguese, having had to do German and Italian, and a lot of Sanskrit translation. A lot. I mean, thousands of verses of Sanskrit translation over the years. The people that say you can't really translate, I think, are deeply mistaken. Not only about translation, but about life. And I think there's no question but that there is a universal reality, which is what the human condition. When you really get into the Sanskrit deeply, you find they're just people like us. Now, of course, there's always a danger of projecting onto them our own views and imagining they're just like us. But there's also the danger of missing the real fact that they are just like us in many ways. I mean, of course they're different. We see the differences. We know how they're different. But the differences are somewhat superficial. And the basic human needs and feelings I found identical. I mean, I say that also having tested this by living in foreign countries. I've lived in many foreign countries and sort of become fluent in the languages. So you really live with people and work with them day after day, and you're not staying in the Hilton Hotel and just going out, out and taking pictures of things. You're really living with the people for years. And you get to know them. They become very intimate associates of yours. And after a while, you just realize that you could be anywhere. And I've done that in various countries. And so yes, I think there is clearly, there are universals. And you don't want to shortchange these specific cultures of different peoples, and we want to really pay attention to what they're saying in their own way. But eventually, you do get to the universals. That's my experience in many different countries and with many different languages. So, a somewhat long-winded answer to your question. And Krishna, in the Gita, says that it's actually to see the oneness behind the diversity is a higher platform. So, any other questions about this stuff? And one last point. The people that did this stuff, this literature, they're very consciously speaking to all people at all times. In other words, if you study this ancient Sanskrit wisdom literature, it very much deals in the language of universals, all creatures. And you'll think, like Krishna says in Gita, Tasmat sarveshu kaleshu, thus at all times one should, in all circumstances, there are certain spiritual principles one should devote oneself or whatever, or remember God. So the literature itself presumes the universality of the human condition in its own language. And so if we say that, well, we can't really understand what they meant, then basically you are arguing against the literature itself, which is expressing itself in universal language, directing it, addressing all people at all times. And so you have the spoilers that want to come in and say, no one can really understand anyone else. But I think that's, obviously, you see what I think about that. I don't think much. Yes?
Why does the translation use the word become soul as opposed to realize?
Because that's what the Sanskrit word is, avut, which is from the verb to be, the verb of bhu, to be. And so that particular word, bhu, there, that's the aorist. It's a form of the past tense which can have a somewhat present meaning, but the notion, it can mean to be or become, in other words, to come to be. It has the sense at times of coming to be, becoming. And so I took it in that sense here, because I think that's what the context implies. Got out of that one. So, we'll go to the Yoga Sutras. And by the way, we're going to finish tonight, even if we're here till, no matter how long it takes. Just kidding. Don't panic. Just kidding. We're going to finish this third book. So with this, we're more than 3/4 of the way through the Yoga Sutras, because the last fourth section is the smallest. So the first verse in this section is Sattva Purushayo Atyanta Asankirnayo Pratyaya Avishesho Bhoga Para Arata Twat Swa Arata Sanyama Purusha Jnana. I quoted this from partly because I was a little tired today, and also because it was fine. I quoted Barbara Soler Miller, who was a very respected scholar at Columbia University, passed away some years ago, and so I quoted her translation. So all the verses are in quotes, I just quoted her translation. But I'll explain it to you in my own words. Worldly experience, which is her translation of Boga. Boga means like enjoyment, but often in the sense of mundane enjoyment. For example, in the devotional tradition, before food is offered to God, food which is not offered, it has no grace to it. It's just called Boga. And then once the food is offered, it's called prasadam, grace. So Boga means sort of like a mundane experience or enjoyment. It has other meanings, shades of meaning, but it's a very interesting word, but at least here it has that sense of Boga, worldly experience. That's why she translates it worldly experience. So she says it's caused by a failure to differentiate. Failure to differentiate is her translation of pratyaya avishesha. Literally means an undistinguishing or undistinguished, an undifferentiated perception. between the lucid quality of nature and the spirit. So this is what's going on here. Sattva, if you look at the word there, sattva purushayoy. Sattva, of the three qualities of nature that we just talked about a few minutes ago, is the quality of goodness, the highest material quality. And there's a tendency, well, okay, Laura, here's the case where the same problem they're talking about occurs today. You can see a clear sameness. There's a tendency in our culture for people, let's say if they see someone who's a good person, a nice person, a generous person, a wise person, to say, oh, he or she is a very spiritual person. Even though that person may not actually be technically, according to this spiritual science, directly engaged in spiritual activities. In other words, it may be mundane piety, like helping people, but helping them to do well in the material world, not helping them to transcend the world and realize their eternal nature. I mean, of course, we have to help each other, and people do help each other, but still, this tendency to call worldly piety spiritual is very common. It's a very common tendency today. And that's what he's talking about here, Patanjali. So people have always had that tendency to call worldly goodness and piety spiritual. As opposed to calling it piety. Whereas spiritual here, it means something very precise. It means that we are eternal souls. And when someone does something for us, or we do something for ourselves, which doesn't merely benefit our bodies, but actually in some direct, explicit way helps to revive our sense of ourselves as eternal beings and brings us closer to our relationship with God, which is one of service, not simply believing that God exists, which is nice. I mean, I believe that everyone in this room exists, but it doesn't mean that I love you. I may just believe you exist. And so it's not just a question of faith in God, but having an actual spiritual relationship. So activities which directly bring that about or favor that development are spiritual. Whereas other activities may be pious. I mean, it's material goodness, such as feeding people, clothing them, and so on and so forth. But there are many people in the world who have plenty of food, plenty of clothes, who are really nasty and unkind to other people. And so what we do not observe in the world is that when people get enough food and health and a roof over their head, that they turn out to be great people. So that distinction is being made, and so sattva here refers to the material goodness, and purusha refers to the soul. And so between this material goodness and the soul, which are, Patanjali uses a very strong word. He says atyanta. Atyanta, which literally means exceedingly. And they are exceedingly, he says, unmixed. In other words, they're exceedingly distinct. They're extremely distinct one from the other. Ordinary goodness and the eternal soul are extremely distinct. They're not the same thing. They're not mixed. And he says, therefore, the pratyaya, the perception of Ishesha, in which there's no distinction between these two, that is the cause of bodha, worldly experience. So that's what Patanjali is saying. I kind of broke that. Is that clear? Or not clear? I tried to sort of break it up for you, but break it up in littler pieces. But let me get on, and I'll show you what he says next. Then he says, para artha twat swa artha sanyama purusha jnana. It is a hard verse. I mean, if you're having a little trouble with this, don't feel bad about that, because it is a somewhat arcane statement. And then he says that from samyama, because there's a series of verses talking about this perfect discipline, samyama, from the perfect discipline of para artatvat, and swa-artatva. So the distinction of your own interest. I'll read what Miller says. From perfect discipline of the distinction between spirit as a subject of itself and the elusive quality of nature as a dependent object. What's that?
It's complicated.
Yeah, and it's not. I mean, it is a difficult statement, and it's not just because we're stupid. It's just a difficult statement. So maybe I'll just say a few more words on it and then go on so we can feel better by doing another one. But para artha means another's interest, not your, and swa artha means your own interest. And so the idea here is that you have to find out what your real self-interest is. And your real self-interest is in the soul, in yourself, in your eternal self. That's your real self-interest. As opposed to living for some foreign interest, which is foreign to the self. Does that make any sense?
I mean, I have an understanding in regards to what he's saying.
I don't want to dwell too long on this because it is a difficult statement, and if Patanjali was alive today, he might even want to rephrase this. But the point is that sometimes, okay, here's an example. Let's say, apart from, I'll give you a practical example, try to bring this down to earth. Let's say, apart from doing what you really need to do for your body, like keeping your body healthy, keeping your body clean, eating good food, and so on and so forth, things that you really need to do, and are completely justified, like keeping your health. Apart from that, if we actually if we indulge ourselves in just, let's say, bodily gratification, like getting obsessed with how I look and how, or how I dress, beyond reasonable limits. In other words, it's not a reasonable endeavor to be healthy, to be well-groomed, just to dress appropriately and nicely and so on. Beyond that, getting too obsessed with the body and the gratification of the body. In that case, we're not pursuing our real interest because we are souls. We are eternal souls. Does that make sense? So we're not pursuing our swa-artha in the language here. It's para-artha. It's an interest which is beyond our real self-interest. And the reason we do that is because we confuse the soul, the eternal soul, with mere things out in the world or projects which seem worthwhile materially, but ultimately don't help the soul.
And those things are the lucid quality of nature.
That seems to be the way he's presenting this. Yeah. Because people who are, let's say, materially lucid, like they eat healthy food and they exercise and they go on, trips to national parks instead of just going to Las Vegas and gambling, and in other words, they kind of do the good, healthy, wholesome stuff. But still, they're not directly pursuing their spiritual realization. They're really just pursuing material enjoyment, bhoga, but in sort of a wholesome, lucid way. And that's kind of what he's talking about here. And so, I think, so this is clear now? Yeah, good. I think good. So then, here's the prize. If someone figures all that out and decides to focus on the soul, then they achieve knowledge of the soul. Simple. So any question on that verse? The rest of them will be a lot easier, I think.
Don't say that.
Okay. Since no one has any questions, we'll go on. Then he says, Tata Pratibha Shavana Vedana Adarsha Ashwada Varta Jayante. This knowledge engenders, in other words, knowledge of your soul engenders intuitive forms of hearing, touch, sight, taste, and smell. That's how Barbara Solar Miller translates this. In other words, if you understand yourself, then you somehow get a deeper intuitive understanding of things you hear, touch, see, taste, and smell. It's a simple statement, actually. I don't think it's too esoteric. That if you're in higher consciousness and begin to understand yourself as an eternal spiritual being, then all of your sense perceptions will be at a much deeper level. You'll understand a lot more what's going on. If they become a distraction, these powers of perfection are impediments to pure contemplation. The siddhis, the word siddhaya, is just the plural of the word siddhi, which is the word for the special powers that come through yoga. And so the special powers of yoga are upasargas, which means in Sanskrit problems, misfortunes. Miller here translates it impediment. They become impediments to samadhi. Her translation is, she translates pure contemplation. These powers become impediments to your pure contemplation if bhutane, if they become a distraction, if they are somehow taking you off the path, that's obviously true. For example, let's say you're an athlete and you're working really, really hard with tremendous dedication, austerity, and sacrifice, and you develop real skill, but then you become real proud and you start kind of, really enjoying how you're beating other people. We've seen it a million times. Pride comes before a fall. In a sense, it's just saying, so people, whether it's in music or business or athletics or anything, or love, in relationships, when people start to really try to enjoy and exploit some of the good things that come from dedication, that becomes an impediment. They start to lose their position, even in a relationship. So it's a simple point here. Bandhakarana shaitiryat prachara samvedanacha chittasya parasharita avesha. From loosening the fetters of bondage to the body, and from awareness of going forth, one thought can enter into the body of another. Okay, now we're going to take a minute off and haunt each other. What this means, I think, is very simple. I'll explain it in I think, Lori, I think once several classes ago you made the point that these things can be understood in a down-to-earth way. Wasn't that you that said that? I think that was you. So I will invoke the spirit of Lori Past. And I think that was you that said that, perhaps that. So the idea is quite simple. If taken an ordinary circumstance, like I'm in a room with a bunch of people, if I'm completely into myself, I'm just totally grooving on myself. Obviously I can't really understand the other people around me. If I'm too much into myself, vain or proud or whatever, the more I'm proud of myself, the less I can really be open to other people, really understand them and appreciate them. And so similarly, Patanjali is saying that if you loosen or relax this being bound to your body, and the things that bind you to the body, like, for example, lust. If I'm lusty, it keeps me very much attached to my body. If I'm greedy, if I'm vain, and so on. And so by loosening these things and learning how consciousness can sort of go forth, then gradually one is able to enter, the mind can enter into the bodies of others. So if you begin to understand this at a simple level, just empathy and sympathy and knowing how other people feel, and that's the general idea, that by loosening, relaxing this grip we have on we're sort of holding on to ourselves, sort of let go, you can start to enter into other people's minds and bodies and understand them, and ultimately carry to a mystic yoga level It's about actually entering the body. I don't know. This obviously can't be just like a ghost that haunts your body or something, but it's... Anyway, this is the ancient yoga literature. So, Udana Jaya Jalapanka Kandaka Adishva Sangha Ukrantischa. From mastery of the vital breath rising in the body, which is Udana, from mastery of that, Jaya, one does not sink into water, mud, or thorns, etc., but rather rises above them. So, I want you all to go and practice this.
Wow.
I mean, one thing we can say philosophically, just sort of looking at this statement, that clearly there's a correlation here that's being claimed here, that if you master certain subtle forces within your body, like these vital breaths, it somehow, if you can master the microcosmic level within yourself, somehow it gives you some power in the larger world to do a similar thing. So ud in Sanskrit means breath. So udana, means up. So udana, the rising breath. It's a system of pancha, that there's 5 kinds of vital airs in the body, all ending in ana. Udana, prana, vyana, samana, and so on. The airs that go up and that go out and that come in, like prana, going forth and so on. And so somehow the breath that goes up, the vital air that goes up, if you can master it and control it, then it somehow gives you the power to rise up above things. So that's... I've never practiced this myself in this life, so that's what it says. And then samana jaya, jwalana, from jaya, this word jaya means conquering, so mastery, jaya, from mastery of samana, another ana, another air. This is the samana, which of the breath of fire in the belly, one acquires a fiery radiance, jwalana. So if you master this internal fire, you develop a jwalana, a sort of a brilliant, fiery radiance. Then stotra akasayo sambandha samyama divya shotram. From perfect discipline of the relation between the ear and space, one has divine hearing. The relation, the sambandha, shotra, the ear or hearing, and akasha, space. Again, in this ancient culture, hearing or sound is somehow intimately connected to space. Because somehow sound and hearing first manifest within space. And so if you understand perfectly the relationship between hearing and space, then somehow this gives you the power to hear things your neighbors don't hear. Namely, divyan shotram, divine hearing. You somehow get this power of divine or celestial hearing. Because you've completely disciplined or this relationship between hearing and space. And so the space extends up into higher realms. So if you've really understood space, you can hear through space up into higher realms. That's the basic idea here. Kaya akashayo sambandha sangya ma laggu tula samapatis cha akashagamana. From perfect discipline of the relation between the body and space. First it was hearing in space. Now it's the body in space. And from becoming light as cotton. One can move through space. So we hear through space. Sound comes to us through space. And naturally our body is in space. And so somehow, if one can really master or get control over the way in which hearing relates to space and the body is in space, then somehow space opens up for you. Somehow space opens up for you. And you find that you could move your body through space in a way that you couldn't before. If you actually understand the relationship between the body and space.
it's hard to believe, though, that thousands of years ago they would have a feeling of space. And I guess because I'm thinking of the difference between the space between the atoms, or the space between you and me, or the outer space. So
if you read the literature, they had a very sophisticated notion of space. And it was also in the sense that they thought about it deeply, about the nature of space. And they definitely had a sophisticated sense of outer space. Yeah, if you read what you read called the Puranic cosmologies, there's a genre of literature called the Puranas. The most famous one is the Bhagavad Purana. And there are 18, we talked about this last night actually, 18 important Puranas. And many of these Puranas have sort of descriptions of the universe. And the dimensions, the distances and everything are far, far beyond what you find in other ancient mythologies. It's much more sophisticated, and it's similar to modern astronomy. And they have some calculations of... it's interesting. What some scholars have studied and found is that the notion of flat Earth, we always very proudly and vainly say how people were so stupid. They thought the Earth was flat. We're afraid you'd fall off. Maybe. But if you look back into the ancient cosmologies, what you really find is that the so-called flat Earth referred not to this planet, but to the plane of the solar system, which is flat, more or less. In other words, if you see where the plane, there's something like a plane on which all the planetary orbits go around. And they were actually taught the Bhumandala, to use the Sanskrit term, like the Earth's sphere. The word Bhu there, which has been translated Earth, really means the greater extension of the solar system. And so they had a serious advanced sense of space. They thought about it a lot. Yes?
So when you say that they were talking about the world, I mean, they're the solar system as being the world, and
yeah, because there are things beyond that also.
Some people refer to the Earth as the world.
Well, yeah, the world.
Solar system could be referred to as the world.
Well, we use the word world in different ways. Sometimes the world, like we talk about the world of ice hockey, or we talk about the world as the Earth, or sometimes the whole world can mean the universe, and so it is a word which is used in different ways. And the same thing in Sanskrit. For example, the word Jagat often means the universe, but it can mean the Earth, as in Jagat Guru, like world guru. And so I think it's pretty much another example of how cultures really aren't that different. A lot of things are used in similar ways. I won't ask you if you have any questions on this, that verse, but there's just a few more to go, and then you can all try. We'll practice becoming as light as cotton. Bahir akalpita vrittir mahavideha tatak prakasha avaranakshaya. The turning of thought without reference to the external world, which is Bahir, the external world, is called the great disembodied thought. The Mahavideha. Deha means body, and Videha means sort of bodiless. The great disembodied thought. From this, the veil that covers the light is destroyed. Okay. So this says that, again, vritti, the first word used in the Yoga Sutras, that yoga is defined as chitta vritti nirodha, stopping the vrittis of the mind, the mundane turnings of the mind. But there is a vritti which is akalpita. It does not refer to, it's not focused on, but here, the external world. And this is called the great disembodied. And from this, kshaya, the destruction, avarana, of the covering, prakasha, of the light. If we take this literally, if we just sort of, I don't want to say demystify this, but if we just look at it simply and say, well, what is he saying? Well, what he's saying very simply is, take it very simply and not get too esoteric here. First of all, there is a covering of enlightenment. Prakasha means light or enlightenment. And obviously our greatest light, our enlightenment, is covered now. We're not fully enlightened now. And you can destroy that covering. And that happens when your mind is not focused outside the external world, but somehow it has discovered a reality, which is not just the external world, but a reality within. And that can come from meditation, or even if you have your eyes open, which sometimes we actually do, sometimes we actually open our eyes, then even looking at the things of this world, we can see within those things the presence of God and the presence of souls. I mean, within all of our bodies, there is an eternal soul. And so if I merely see you as a body, which is somewhat insulting almost, because you're an eternal being, so if I merely see you as your external form, I am really underestimating you. So if our mind is focused not externally, but looking at the eternal reality, which is within everything, that God is within everything, souls are within everything, then that's called, according to Patanjali, Mahavideha. That is the great situation, or the great consciousness, which is not based on the physical body. And if you come to that, then whatever is covering your higher consciousness will be removed. So it's simple. Good stuff, as I say. So, then, Stula, Swarupa, Sukshma, Anvaya, Artha, Vatva, Sanyamat, Bhuta, Jaya. From perfect discipline of the gross, intrinsic, subtle, relational, and purposive aspects of the elements of matter, one attains mastery over them. What could be more clear than that? So, okay, I'll take a shot at this. What the prize here is Bhuta Jaya. Jaya, victory over, or mastery over Bhuta, which Barbara Miller here takes to be the elements of matter, which are sometimes called Bhutas. So that comes from Sanyamat. It comes Sanyamat from perfect discipline over, and she takes it to mean these elements. Stula. Stula means sort of the gross part of it. Like you're talking about, say, this chair, just the old hard seat and the physical metal part of it. That's the stula, just the gross matter of it. And then there's the Swarupa, its real nature, its real form, which you could say is ultimately the substance matter. If you think of the word substance, which Aristotle used, literally that's what stands beneath it. In other words, here it looks like metal, it's a chair, but beneath that is standing a reality, which is that it's just matter, it's just that energy, material energy. So that would be, you could say, Swarupa. And then Sukshma, the subtle form of it, which could be its possibilities, the subtle things its potentialities. Anvaya, its relationships to other things. Artha, its purpose, in this case to be a chair. I don't know if we can really go through this list for every material thing we come across. It would make life quite technical. I mean, you couldn't sit in a chair until you've gone down your checklist.
I'm sure it exists.
Probably someone else would take your seat before you got through your list. So, but still, Patanjali is saying that somehow, if you discipline all these things, then you gain mastery over them. So, if a yogi is sitting down and meditating for hundreds or thousands of years, as they are said to do, or just for a long time, let's say, whatever it is, then somehow or other, it's sort of like this have to deal very thoroughly with the world. It's a real discipline. And I guess if you have nothing else to do, if you have no family life, no movies, you don't have a computer, no friends, because the yoga system is often practiced in isolation. You really have nothing else to do. And there you are up in the mountains, in the Himalayan mountains, with nothing else to do, and a long time to do nothing else. And so maybe this is a way of meditating very comprehensively, very thoroughly on the nature of material things. So that, and I suppose, again, let's say you went through this list with one object or two objects. I think the point here is not to spend the rest of your life going through this list, which would drive any yogi, I think, after a while. Well, probably driving back down the mountain to the cities to get a real job. But it seems that if you go through this a few times, you come to a state of consciousness which would just naturally be in the right state of mind to sort of naturally deal with things properly. So this is kind of an exercise to go through, not something you do for the rest of your life, it seems to me. Because how could you do the yoga? How could you? There's all kinds of other things you're supposed to meditate on. So the last one for this third section of the Yoga Sutras is Tatonima Adi Pradurvava Kaya Sampata Dharma Anadikatascha. Then extraordinary powers appear. Pradurvava means appear, appearance. Such as the power to be small as an atom, anima. Anima means anu. Anu means minute, or the smallest, or atom, anu. So from the word anu, anima, which means atomic or microscopic or whatever. So these powers, one of the yoga powers is you can make yourself very tiny. And, if you can make yourself a little tiny, I suppose you can, walk through walls, walk through if you get small enough, you can sort of walk through anything, and obviously no one's going to see where you are, and you can do all kinds of, probably somebody would make a movie about you someday. But that is one of the yoga powers. So, Tatonium Adi, with the appearance from this, as well as bodily perfection, Kaya Sampat, which Barbara Stoller Miller translates as bodily perfection, and immunity from the constraints of matter, Tadharma Anavighatascha. And that all comes from this Bhuta Jaya. In other words, when you've conquered over the material elements, then you can just sort of do what you want. You can manipulate your own body. So these are some of the fantastic powers which were attributed to the perfect yogis. Any questions on any of this? Don't try this at home.
I've heard that some people...
You may make yourself microscopic, you won't be able to figure out how to make yourself normal again. See these little tiny people walking into the next class saying, is there a mantra to get me back?
I've heard of people going to the Himalayas and practicing yoga for 20, 30 years and acquiring some level of perfection and coming down and then basically mesmerizing the people and claiming to be God. They may do some sort of magic. Is there bhakti is acquisition? You can achieve, you can bring something from a far distance, and then you show it, and then
I think that is a problem. I think that some yogis, some people that practice yoga, gain certain powers and then exploit that power in their relations with other people. Because after all, unless someone is deeply virtuous, there's a tendency to use any power you have. Like if someone's really good looking, or someone's really good at business, or is a good talker, or whatever, there's a tendency just to use whatever you've got to enjoy and to get other people to do what you want them to do.
Yeah, and Patanjali is working against that.
Yeah. Becomes an upasarga. It becomes, what Miller translates as an impediment. It's more than an impediment. It means it becomes a misfortune. It becomes a problem. And there are cases in the history of India of yogis that apparently have certain powers and use their powers to do all kinds of indecent things, to exploit women, to get money from people, to be worshipped as God, and the people who weren't God and eventually were exposed as not being God. So, excuse me?
They were human.
Yes. Very human. Almost like bullies, almost like when you're growing up, some kid on your block is like bigger and stronger than the other kids and kind of pushes them around. So you come down from the mountains with all these powers and, don't mess with Yogi so-and-so. So, no other questions on that, Lori?
No, it's starting to make sense now.
Oh, good.
From each one of them seems to start out with some really big deal, and then the rest of it kind of brings us together. He's saying, folks, just don't come in here and think you're going to sit here and listen to this, and you're going to be spiritual. You've got to do some of these things too. If you do it right, here's the things that can happen for you. And you'll have these great things to do, but don't abuse them if you do it.
Yeah, exactly.
And he tells you 1, 2, 3 what to do, just like he said, it's a how-to book.
Yeah. Yeah, it's one of the original, like Yoga for Dummies books. So, thank you all, and